Today we're going to walk through how to prep for and install the version 2 of the Flyin Miata frame rails and butterfly braces. We'll start with getting the stock rails worked back into shape, test fitting everything and drilling the needed holes, priming and undercoating any bare metal areas, and we'll go through any tools you need for each step along the way. We're going to be spending a lot of time under the car, so make sure you get it as high as you can. In my case, I like to throw a couple concrete blocks under the tires, add some jack stands, and then I also have a jack in the back supporting the diff. You want to make sure it's as secure as possible because if your frame rails are anything like mine, you're going to be swinging a hammer and hitting those pretty hard trying to get them back straight. Now, before we go get too excited with a hammer, let's go ahead and take out the interior seats and carpet, just so that you don't get all that greasy, grimy nastiness on the underside of the car all over your nice interior. Depending on what you have for seats, you'll have 4 14mm bolts for the seat. If you need to take out the seat belt, you can remove the lower bolt here, and it'll be a 17mm. With the seats out, next you're going to want to pull the carpet up. So start with this trim piece down here and just give it a gentle tug. There's a few clips on the back side, or in the case of mine, a few fewer than there should be. And set that to the side. Then if you didn't already remove your seat belt, then you're going to need to, so you can go ahead and pull this back. Depending on if you have any of the trim clips, you're going to have a trim clip here and here. You can go ahead and remove those. Peel that up out of the way. Then come down, pull these up, and tuck your carpet out from underneath of that trim piece. Now what you can do is pull this up. Conveniently, you can take these holes on this side at least and slide them over the handbrake, or just take a bungee cord and hook it up to the rearview mirror to hold it up. You'll want to pull up this nasty carpeting material under here, depending on how old it is, and just make sure it's out of the way. That stuff will tangle up in your drill and give you all kinds of fun. Particular to the driver's side, you're going to have the dead pedal here. Go ahead and take the 2 10mm nuts off of there, and then you can pull this free, and the carpet will move a little bit further, give you a little more room to work. With that dead pedal removed and everything bungee corded up, your driver's side should look something along the lines of this. Go ahead and do the same thing on the other side, and you're ready to jump underneath. Now it's time to get those frame rails back in shape. You have a few choices for encouragement tools. Your regular standard hammer, a mini sledge, and a C-clamp is nice if you want to be a little less destructive. So let's jump into the car and I'll show you what to do. Before we go just swinging away with a hammer, take your frame rail, line it up to the existing frame rail, and slide it down so you find the spot where it catches. Anywhere that it catches, the frame rail is not going to fit over top of, so we're going to need to tighten these in. This is probably my worst case, so let's start with this one. Sometimes you'll get lucky and these will tighten in, same on both sides. In this case, this side's pretty much flat now, but over here is still sticking out. So next step is flip your C-clamp around the other way, give it another go. Next we'll move on to the hammer. You can see really all we're doing is pulling this side in more, so we're going to have to move over to the hammer so we can knock this back in. We'll try to get it square. Once you're pretty comfortable with what you've done, go ahead and check again with your frame rail, make sure everything slides over smoothly, move down to your next point that sticks, and start over again. One more tip if you're having a hard time getting the C-clamp to clamp evenly on each side. If it's caving one side in while not pulling the dented side back in, You can throw a piece of bar stock along one side. So here I just have a about 1 inch piece of bar stock over on the side. Just helps spread out the load from this part of the clamp. Should help keep the side from caving in and help you bring in the bump on the other. Chances are you've taken off a fair amount of primer, undercoating, and probably a little bit of metal. So we want to make sure that none of that's going to rust. And the first part of that is to get all that loose material off so that we can put a nice coat of primer and undercoating back on. So go ahead and grab a wire brush, an abrasive wheel, a wire cup on a drill, and a good pair of goggles, and climb into your car. Scrape off all that loose junk that came off when you were straightening the frame rails to get it ready for paint. With everything cleaned up, come back with any sort of universal primer, etch primer, anything like that that'll bond straight to raw metal. To help get everything lined up under the car, go ahead and test fit everything together. Do not tighten these down more than just finger tight. We're going to need some adjustability as we slide everything in place. The shorter or the narrower cross brace goes on the back side in the two holes that are closer together. The wider brace goes up the front and goes in this hole. Make sure when you're test fitting that the notches are facing the inside. Then we'll take this, flip it over, and raise it up into position. Going around, all the butterfly brace holes are fairly easy to thread in, except this one. There's a bit of, you can't really go in by hand. The hole is a little bit offset. The threads don't quite line up. It still will thread in with a socket, but just a small issue there. If you're working by yourself like I am, a floor jack and a piece of wood makes this a lot easier. You can lift it all up into place without trying to lift it by hand. What you're trying to do is align the frame rails obviously to the current frame rails, and then on the NB Miatas you're trying to align the front hole of this brace to this hole here. You're going to add a spacer just to account for the fact that the metal is thicker on this side, so that way this can sit flat against the rest of the subframe. For the butterfly brace to subframe on the NBs, you're going to come in with a bolt from the top, put a spacer in between your brace and the subframe, get your hole lined up, and go ahead and hand start your threads. Once everything's in position, each of your frame rails on the inside, this flange here should line up with the seam in the body as close as you can get it, and that'll give you the room you need up here. And make sure both sides are aligned and we're ready to drill the first holes. Now that we're ready to start drilling, what I like to do is use a smaller pilot bit and then either use a step drill bit or a drill bit that's just a little bit oversized, and that gives you just a little bit of room for maneuvering everything into place. Before you start drilling, come back up top and make sure your carpet's still out of the way. If you're having problems with it falling down, take a piece of scrap wood and toss it here. That way, if it does fall down, your drill will hit the wood and not tear up your carpet. When we drill these holes, we'll want to do 2 per frame rail. Go ahead and snug those up through the car, and then we'll come back and drill the rest of these holes. That way nothing shifts around. With the 2 butterfly braces in place, everything should stay where it is, but just to be sure, you don't want to drill your holes and realize half of them are out of position. So the drill bit is most likely going to want to walk, so you can either do a center punch or go ahead and put some pressure on it and run the drill slow to start. Depending on the size of your step drill, you have a couple options. You can either try to get this up close enough to the body to where you can make the size hole you need with the step drill, or you can go ahead and do these first two just with your regular large drill bit. Test fit, make sure everything's good. Then we will go up top, drop the bolt down, and go ahead and hand tighten everything in place and snug it up. Make sure not to tighten these down too much unless you have the washer up top. We're just trying to get everything roughly in position here. So now we'll move down to the next hole. Repeat that for the other two sides, and then we're ready to drill the rest. For these last two holes on the inner side of each rail, you'll most likely need to pull off the rear butterfly brace just to get access. So go ahead and drop that out of the way and drill your last two holes. And then we will go ahead and drop the frame rails and the front butterfly brace as well. That way we can go ahead and hit all these holes with the step drill to knock off the burrs, and then hit them with some primer and some undercoating to keep them from rusting. There are a ton of ways to get rid of these little burrs around each of the holes, but I would just take a step drill and run it around. That'll knock the edges off. Do that for all the holes. Make sure to come through and just check for any burrs on the underside. Before we go spraying any primer or undercoating, we want to mask off anything on the inside just to make sure none of the overspray from the bottom gets up into the car. So I like to just throw a couple sheets of cardboard down, make sure to do both sides, and then we'll head underneath to hit it with some primer. With all your burrs cleaned up, come back through with your primer and touch up all your holes, as well as any of the primer that may have gotten scuffed while you were test fitting the frame rails. I'm using just a standard Rust-Oleum undercoating to provide a little bit of sound deadening, and then just some extra rust protection while we're down here. While we wait for the paint to dry, we can start the oh so fun long process of removing all of this plastic coating, all this wrap. Next, come back up, pull your masking cardboard out of the way, and go ahead and drop in all your bolts. On the driver's side, you're going to use all of the long bolts with a washer underneath. You'll have 12 bolts on this side. The short bolts are going to be for the passenger side, so they clear the fuel lines and brake lines. Moving back down to the underside, you're going to go ahead and get your frame rail into position. Don't worry too much about moving any of these out of the way. Go ahead and, if you can, hand tighten one or two of these to hold everything in place. With one nut on each side, you can go ahead, come back, and line up any of the rest of your bolts that may have shifted. Laying on your side, you should be able to get one arm inside the car to hold the top of the bolt, and then use your other hand to straight the nut on the bottom. Once you have a couple hands started, come back and hand start a few more for the washer. All of these will need a washer between the nut. It's just a little easier when you're trying to hold the frame rail and hand start everything for the first time, just to not worry with the washer. So now that we have it somewhat held in place, we can come back and put the washers in. Make sure that every bolt gets a washer on the top and every nut gets a washer on the bottom. Once you have all the hardware in and snug down, I have you ready to come back and torque. So for this, you want to be between 20 and 25 foot-pounds. Tightening the front bolt on the front butterfly brace is a little tricky. You'll need a 14mm wrench, box end or open, doesn't matter. And you'll need to come in from basically where the wheel is, straight back to here. It's really the only angle you can get to it. you can hold it in place, and as you torque this down, it will most likely push up against the chassis, and you can use that to hold it. Since the frame rails cover up the previous mounting points for the fuel and brake lines, we need to take the bracket, straighten it out so that it looks like this, and then that way it can mount to the underside of the frame rail. To do that, you're going to take the plastic piece, rotate it 45 degrees until the cross lines up. Slide that out, and then we're going to take this, put it in the vise. You can either bend by hand or take a small hammer. You can also do this with a pair of vice grips, honestly laying it down on the floor with a hammer, or with the C-clamp that we used earlier. Just happen to have a bench vise, so I'll be using that. With this roughly flat, next take it and vise like this, tighten it down. That'll make it nice and flat the rest of the way. Flip it over, do the same thing for the large tab. And that's one bracket. Go ahead, reinstall your plastic piece here. Do the same for the other one. And now we can go install these on the car. You're going to want to start by putting back in place the free-floating guides. In my case, I don't have a return for the evap from the fuel tank back up to the engine, so I only have 2 lines here. With that one in place, we can move down here to the one that's actually held in by the bracket. So the bracket's going to sit like this. And in the kit, there are 2 lock nuts. So go ahead and place the bracket over the stud, tighten down the lock nut. This is a 10 mil, and you gotta need to torque it to any particular spec. Just snug it up tight. It is a lock nut, so it'll stay in place. Now take your lines and pull them down into the bracket, and that'll help keep everything from rubbing under here, either on the bolts or on the frame rail. Put the other bracket on and the other free-floating plastic piece at the end. Moving down to the far end, you can see the fuel lines a bit close to that bolt there, so what we can do is actually take this clip, install it upside down, and it will help space everything apart. You may need to trim this cover back just for some clearance, depending on how tight that ends up sitting. To give a little more room back here, you can come in with a pair of snips and trim this cover. Just going to cut right at that. That will give both these lines a little bit more room. And with that in place, that'll keep anything from rubbing under here. With the frame rail all installed, everything torqued down to 20 to 25 foot-pounds, go ahead and come back up top and vacuum up any metal shavings, anything like that, and we can get the carpet put back. With everything cleaned up, the frame rails and butterfly braces in place, reinstall your carpet, seats, and seat belts, and you're all done. I found that despite what Flyin Miata claims, don't try to jack the car from directly on the frame rails. They'll still buckle if you don't have a completely flat jack pad, and the last thing you want after all this work is another set of mangled frame rails. Thanks for watching.